I mean, you think about the last few years. I don't know exactly how many, but my guess is 3 or 4 or 5 million people, depending on how you draw the boundaries, did something for the first time, first in speaking out against the war and then later on in the election. I mean, they stood in a vigil, they wrote a letter, they called an official, they registered a voter, they knocked on a door. I mean, primarily those kinds of humble actions that by themselves seem very small and insignificant, but taken together in the aggregate can change history. I mean, I did what I always do in the election, which is spend some time in some precincts, and I always kind of alternated between calling Florida and Ohio on the phone and walking precincts in Washington State, and we have the governor's race settled by 93 votes. Well, mostly settled still, of course. 93 votes isn't very much in the state of 5 million. What I did multiplied by what everybody else did, mattered. Going back to knock on the door of the person who drove a taxi and was sleeping until 2 in the afternoon, and you had to go back at 2 o'clock in the afternoon to remind them. I was glad I did that. That was one vote. All those efforts that you folks did carry in Pennsylvania, and that was due to hard work. It didn't just happen. So part of what I think is, I look at all the people who participate, and I think, if they stick around, that's a lot of people. I mean, if they stick around, that's a lot. And there may be people in this audience who, the first few years are the first time we got involved. I mean, if everyone sticks around, that's a larger social justice movement than we've had in years, decades even. And a very powerful force. And who knows, I mean, the next King or Gandhi or Parks or Pavel, I mean, maybe comes from somebody who just got their start during this period. You have to start somewhere. And so I look at that and I find that heartening, because it suggests to me that again, you don't know where history is going to turn, but also that if we are reaching out, and if we are bringing the people in, and if we're extending the discussion, every conceivable way. I remember a friend who cuts hair, and been talking about some of these, the difficult issues in the hair salon, and even I guess lost a few customers over it, but also spurred up some really good conversations. I mean, that stuff matters wherever we do it. So instead of saying, well, we lost, even though, again, we have to be able to look things squarely and say, this is the lay of the land. And let's say, okay, this is this particular moment in the process of building the movement for justice. And it's a moment where that movement suffered a setback, but it's also a moment where some important, powerful things happened here. Also globally. I mean, Desmond Tutu points it out. He says, look at all those countries that the U.S. tried to bribe into joining them. I mean, it was just, poor countries mostly. I mean, Turkey, it was like a bidding war. 1 billion, 2 billion, 5 billion. I think it stopped at 30 billion. It was some immense amount of money we were trying to offer them, and they refused. Every time I heard the phrase the coalition forces, I thought it was like, well, us, Britain, and then it's like a child with their imaginary friends. That's the product of courage, of people speaking out. Again, reminds us that we're not alone. So I think that's part of the challenge. Part of the challenge is to, in terms of keeping on in difficult times, to go forward with humor and imagination. There's a great story where I think I mentioned I've got an email list where if you sign up, it'll go to the books once a month. Roughly, when I have to write articles, I'll send out articles. And one of the things I did with the list, of course, bring together the gospel take a while, is I just said, here, I'm doing this book on political hope and persistence, and are there wonderful essays that inspire you? And I got just a lot of people suggested the same folks I was already going to, Ben Della and Howard, and Mary Wright, Ella, and Alice Walker, all the famous names. I mean, that people just name because they also admired them. But then other people just sent in pieces of their own, or ones they'd heard of it. There was an amazing story. There was a guy who was a Boeing worker. I mean, he didn't have any fancy jobs, made airplanes on an assembly line. And his wife was from Zambia, which is formerly Northern Rhodesia. And it was this very short story about how the country got its freedom from the British. And it was a largely nonviolent uprising called the Cha-Cha-Cha. And the way it started was, there was this law where if you were black and bought something from a white store, you had to have it handed down through the window. And this is very degrading. I mean, very, very humiliating. And deliberately so. I mean, in one of the sort of subtle ways to enforce deference and subordination. And so somebody got the idea of buying a Land Rover and went into the dealership and bought his Land Rover and said, well, I'd like it handed out through the window. And they said, well, you know, sir, I mean, don't worry about that, you know, you can drive it out from the gate. I mean, we appreciate your business. You don't have to worry about that. He said, no, it has to be obeyed. And I said, but, you know, sir, it's a large car, it's a small window. You know, we don't think it's going to fit. It's not going to fit. And well, I'm sorry, the law has to be obeyed. And they go back and forth a few more times, and he gets into the car, and he drives it out through the window and through the wall. And this inaugurates this resistance movement. And it spreads all over the country. And at a certain point, they bring in this very stern-jawed British administrator to put the uprising down. And, you know, he's not going to look any nonsense, and, you know, he's going to be tough and all the rest of that stuff. And one of the organizers gets the idea of greeting him at the airport with hundreds of the largest women that she can find naked on the runway. And his plane touches down, and he looks out and he sees this sea of very large naked women. And they're very nice, they're waving and they're you know, smiling and greeting him. And this is not in this Colonial Administrator's 101 handbook. He does not know what to do. He asks the pilot to turn around and take him back to England. And they do, and the country gets its freedom a few weeks later. And I just love that story because it reminds me that, I mean, God knows humans are capable of some pretty horrible behavior and short-sighted behavior, but we're also capable of some serious imagination and humor as well. And we have to remember that as we're acting. And part of the challenge, I think, is to not get beaten down by what we're opposing. Because if we do, we'll probably lose. But if we keep spirit alive, then we have a much more powerful voice. And I think of a couple stories that exemplify that. One is, there's a friend of mine who died at 101 years old about a year and a half ago. And an amazing woman in Hazel Wolf. And she had this just long history. She started out, I think it was her first public action. She was like 11 years old and wanted to play basketball. And this is like 1909. She said, of course girls can't play basketball. And she said, of course we can. And we'll show you if you give us the equipment. And they sort of backed down. So this is the lesson of small steps sometimes lead to bigger ones. And then she became a labor organizer in her 20s and organized unions all around Washington State, where I live in the Pacific Northwest. And one of the interesting things is that they passed one of the first public pension systems that became a model for Social Security, which of course is now on the table as the Bush administration tries to Enronize everything. And, you know, Social Security, you know, one of the first points. But when she retired at 65, she was a secretary, never made much money, and she lived on Social Security. So one of the things that, you know, that was interesting was seeing something where in her 20s, she ends up taking a stand, and it comes back to benefit her and millions of other people, you know, 50 years, 20 years, 50 years later. And then she, in her 60s, got involved in the Audubon Society and environmental issues, and actually put together some of the first, because of her background, first labor environmental issue coalitions in the country, which was really interesting. I mean, one of the developments that I find heartening in the last 15 years is the labor movement and the environmental movement 15 years ago were pretty separate and sometimes even hostile. And gradually they've begun to work a lot together. I mean, major AFL-CIO leaders and the major environmental leaders meet at least once, usually twice a year, to try and coordinate common strategies. They work together during elections. There's a lot of on-the-ground efforts. And efforts like the new Apollo project, which is the idea of investing America's resources in alternative energy, manufacturing that benefits the economy here, but also addresses issues like global warming. All that's really powerful. And Hazel, you know, back in really 40 years ago, was sort of blazing the way for that.